Hello. Welcome to the most amazing talk at GDC. This talk is called Gods and Dumps. I'll get to why it's called that in a bit. It's about attribute tuning. Specifically, this is very narrowly focused on tuning attributes in Pillars of Eternity. Who am I? Who are any of us, really? I am a game director, Josh Sawyer. I'm at Obsidian Entertainment, where I've been for the past 11 years. I've been a tabletop role-playing gamer for about 30 years. I started with basic Dungeons & Dragons. I've been a CRPG developer for the past 17 years, starting at Black Isle Studios, actually this month. And I started out doing area and narrative design, but I primarily focus on system design and direction these days. What are we even talking about? We're talking about Pillars of Eternity. If you're not familiar with the game, it was a Kickstarter-funded game that is inspired by the Infinity Engine role-playing games from the late 90s, early 2000s. That means Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and Planescape Torment. And we had 77,000 amazing backers who helped us raise over $4 million. And we released the game in 2015, and we just finished releasing the second part of our expansion, the White March, earlier this year. We are specifically talking about attributes, or what is commonly called ability scores in Dungeons & Dragons. This is your strength, dex, constitution, all that sort of stuff. I'm amazed this talk was approved, because this is easily the most narrowly focused talk I've ever given. I'm going to be talking about things using the terms viable and optimal. I'd like to define those just so it's clear what I'm talking about. Viable means you can actually get through the game with it, like your character will live. And I don't really mean by the skin of your teeth. I mean, like, you can actually do it. It's not a nightmare of frustration. Optimal means the sort of high end where a min-maxer will take a character by, scrimping and scraping and finding every single bonus they can possibly get. A big focus that we had on Pillars was to kind of try to reduce the gulf between viability and the optimal end. It makes it a lot easier to balance, but obviously we want min-maxers to be able to go crazy because that's fun. Even though I hate fun, by the way. What I mean by gods and dumps is it's kind of common when people are talking about stats in games to talk about things in terms of a god stat or a dump stat. A god stat is a stat that is extremely, extremely good for the class or a build. You always want to max that out as much as possible. A dump stat is a stat that you can just put it in the toilet, like nobody cares. It's not going to really affect your character, how you play the game. Maybe a class doesn't rely on that stat at all, and that's something that we are watching out for throughout the course of development of Pillars. So I'm going to go back into the archives because Pillars of Eternity is a very nostalgia-driven game. Obviously, we were inspired by the Infinity Engine games. The Infinity Engine games were based on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, except for Icewind Dale 2, which was 3rd Edition D&D. So there's a big legacy there that we had to pay attention to. We didn't have to do exactly what those games did, but if we strayed too far away, then understandably our backers would be kind of annoyed at a minimum. So what we're really talking about when we mean attributes in class-based role-playing games is AD&D, Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. A lot of games have their own variations on this, but really it started with pre-basic. It started before basic. There's a version of Dungeons & Dragons that's just after Chainmail, which was the sort of hardcore tactical tabletop war game, and even that had stats back then. So they go back a very long way, but lots of games have them now. Ultima, Final Fantasy games have them, Dark Souls have them. Lots of games that have classes also have ability scores. Those can come into conflict, which I'll be talking about, but it's very widespread in role-playing games for these things to exist. They're used to define and distinguish the fundamental things about a character. So how strong they are, how tough they are, how smart they are, how well-spoken they are. These sort of very basic concepts of a character. Originally, in the olden days, they were always random. Actually, what I found when I was doing some research is that in the first Dungeons & Dragons before Basic, the Dungeon Master actually rolled the stats for the player's characters, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, there's a big emphasis on randomization, but eventually, over time, it shifted to point buy. Computer role-playing games tend to have things as point buy because, otherwise people just sit there and they roll and roll and roll and roll, which some people have fun with, but it makes it kind of hard to balance the game that way. And yeah, so the traditional stats in Dungeons & Dragons are strength, constitution, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. And can anyone remember the 7th attribute that was in? Thank you. 7th attribute that was introduced in Unearthed Arcana was comeliness, and it went away immediately in 2nd edition. Yeah, because how beautiful your character was is not necessarily the most important stat to have in D&D. So in the olden times, meaning from basic through 2nd edition, you would roll your dice, and then you would figure out what class you could be. So it wasn't, and it's actually interesting, if you go back and you look at the text in the old players' handbooks, it really does say roll your stats, then think about what character you want to make. Whereas I think now, especially in the language of players' handbooks and things like that, you sort of conceive a character, and then maybe you roll or you allocate stats, but you kind of do it in that order. But in the olden days, it really was like, well, maybe you can play a paladin. I mean, can you get a 17 charisma? Because then you can play a paladin. If not, you're not playing a paladin. There were lots of dump stats, a whole bunch of them, so there were plenty of stats that classes could ignore. It didn't really matter. And there were big dead ranges. I'll talk about scaling of values, but in a lot of cases, D&D, AD&D, between 8 and 14, not a lot really changed. Or if they did change, they were really minor secondary things like carry weight and stuff like that. Oh, you know what? I just forgot to tell you guys. We do have review forms. I'm sorry, I'm completely ruining the flow. We do have review forms for this. Please fill out the evaluations at the end. And if you have cell phones, please silence them. I was supposed to say at the beginning, but I screwed up. Anyway, so because of the fact that you were rolling these, and because you had these big dead zones, and you have these requirements for how you play the class, viability was always in question. You might not be able to play a character of a certain class, or if you allocated stats, they might be so bad that that character would either immediately die, like in the first session, or they would eventually just run out of steam and you couldn't, practically speaking, play them anymore. I'll give us a few examples of how this might work. So here's one, the reasonably intelligent wizard in AD&D. Make a wizard with a 14 intelligence. It's a bad idea. You might say, like, well, 14 on a scale of 3 to 18, 14 sounds pretty high. According to the player's handbook, I have 140 IQ. I'm a genius. I'm an amazing wizard. Wrong, you suck. Because as soon as you advance to 13th level, you're going to realize you can't cast 7th level spells or higher. So you can keep advancing, but you're not doing crap. I mean, you can find ways to boost your intelligence, but if you built your character that way, you're going to run into some trouble. You thought you were going to be this dude. You're this dude. Reasonably strong fighter in AD&D. This is not quite as bad. So you start with a 15 strength. By the way, Khalid in Baldur's Gate had a 15 strength. I'm just going to mention that because it's not a very good strength score. And then you take specialization, because fighters specialize in weapons. And your damage is really, really bad. So if you use a two-handed sword against medium or small creatures, just in case anyone's wondering, you'll do 1d10 plus 2, because you have specialization, which is 7.5 average damage, versus 1d10 plus 8, which is 13.5 average damage. That's pretty bad. And you might say, well, I'm going to get some more stuff later, so I can work my way out of this hole. So you get up to 13th level, you take Grand Mastery, you're using combat and tactics rules, whatever. So, and then you get a plus 4 weapon, and your damage is still terrible. And the thing is, now it's even worse because this is being multiplied across multiple attacks. So this gulf is, like, you can play this way, but this character is way worse than the character that's sort of maxed out. So you thought you were going to be this guy, but you're this guy. In 3rd edition, there was a shift. The explicit class requirements went away. So it no longer said, hey, you have to have a 17 charisma to be a paladin. There were lots of implicit things that you were supposed to do. Usually you could see them if you read the abilities and say, like, oh, wow, a lot of my abilities are based off of wisdom or charisma. I should probably focus on that. Bonus XP for your class disappeared. So there was a thing in AD&D where if you had higher than a certain thing in your main stats, then you'd get more XP, which is giving a reward to someone that's already doing really well. So they got rid of that because that's weird. Also, 3rd edition got rid of the non-linear progression. So they went to every even step, you would get +1. So that changed the feeling of it. It is much more consistent, but that sort of massive ramp up at each end went away. There were multiple builds that were viable. You could build characters in a few different ways. Not necessarily optimal, especially as you get to higher level in 3rd edition. That stuff gets really tricky. Some of the classes arguably required only 3 stats to be pretty good. Others, like monks and paladins, are very notable because they need 4 to be at least kind of good. Or if you do not do that, then some of your class abilities will be stinky poo-poo. And then D&D introduced splat books. If you're not familiar with the term splat book, it's an expansion book that usually introduces a bunch of crazy stuff, like cool new prestige classes and insane feats that your DM should say no to. But they introduced lots of neat gimmick build possibilities because you could do something like make a high intelligence fighter that was actually a good character. Whereas if you made a high charisma or a high intelligence fighter in core 3rd edition, that's a shitty fighter. Like, that might be a really cool character to roleplay with. That character is very bad at doing their job, which is fighting. 3.5, or 3E and 3.5 is really a min-maxer's delight. It clarified a lot of rules, but it left a lot of room for optimization. So, it said, well, here are all the rules, but here are all these bonus types. So if you can search through every single source book and combine bonuses in the right way, you can just really go crazy. People made a lot of character builders for 3E and 3.5 and for Pathfinder. Those character builders allow you to rapidly see where all these stats can come from. And people are insane on online forums. They're crazy. They'll come up with really, really crazy stuff. As an example of this, I like to use the example of Lollerskate. There is a forum, Something Awful, and in their traditional games forum, they had this ultra high level character contest to see who could make the most insane character. And the winner was an insane Australian person who made this. You can't see the stats super clearly, but this is ludicrous. He's like a Yonti anathema, and he had like 7 classes or 6 classes and 755 hit points. And so yeah, you could go really, really, really crazy in 3rd edition D&D. And so people really like to min-max, but we also know that when the potential for min-maxing the optimal character, when that character gets too far away from the viable character, it's really hard to balance content in any meaningful way because the gulf is so huge. So in Pillars of Eternity, when we set out to make our ability scores, we had a few goals. These things were not necessarily things that we started out with, but that we moved toward them over time. 6 attributes, which is D&D's. Class abilities that are not explicitly associated with attributes. So for example, if you look at 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, a paladin's smite is in part based off of their charisma score. We didn't do things like that where classes have very specific abilities keyed to specific ability scores. The statistics, the attributes would influence statistics of importance to all classes. And obviously, there's variability in there as to how significant that is, but our goal was to say, try to influence things that all classes use, rather than things that some classes can safely ignore, or they don't have any meaning to them, because then you get into situations where you can just dump stuff, or certain classes really need more stats than other classes. A primary goal was no bad builds. What that really means in practice is that if you have an idea for a wacky character, like the super genius barbarian, that is a viable character. Doesn't mean it's necessarily an optimal character, but it is a viable character. So we wanted people to be able to make the crazy characters, like their charismatic fighter or their clumsy rogue or whatever sort of weird thing they wanted to come up with. And instead of that being a character that is just fundamentally, you're not going to get anywhere with it, it was viable. Not optimal, but viable. And we had a secondary goal, which was to ensure that dumping stats stung a little bit. This was kind of a reality check on our systems, just to make sure that, like if we thought a benefit from a stat was really important, if people dumped it, then really they didn't think the bonus that was being granted was that important. So we needed to go back and look at it again. So why did we do these things? Why do we have 6 attributes? Tradition. I mean, that's the main thing. We asked our fans on our forums, and they'd be like, somewhere between 5 and 7. I don't know, maybe 6, I guess. But it was pretty common. I mean, some people genuinely did say like 05 or 07, but a lot of people said 6. They wanted 6. It felt comfortable. It fit this type of game, so that's what we did. Also, there were some nice things, though. The pairs worked out well for our 3 secondary defenses, which are Fortitude, Reflex, and Will. And defenses are not opt-out. I saw someone who made a more elegant sort of way of saying this, but defenses are things that you use when you're attacked, and as long as the content actually attacks these different defenses with some regularity, the player They can't not participate in that, if that makes sense. Whereas certain things in D&D, like if you say, like, I don't care how long the duration of anything is, so I'm going to just dump this stat. Defenses, as long as they're being attacked, you don't want them to be bad because you will suffer for it. So 6 attributes worked into 3 pairs, and that worked out pretty well. Class ability is not associated with attributes. The reason we did this is if you make explicit ties between certain stats and fundamental class abilities, then there's an emphasis there on viability. So it's sort of saying if you don't max the stat, or if you don't have the stat at least a pretty decent value, this character sucks. So for comparison, if you think about the example of the wizard with a 14 intelligence in D&D versus intellect in Pillars of Eternity, intellect affects durations and it affects area of effect for all characters in Pillars of Eternity. So you can make a wizard that has small or low durations and small area of effect. That's actually fine. It's not going to prevent the character from learning spells or casting spells or anything like that. So there's a big difference there. Similarly, if you look at charisma in 3rd edition D&D, it's extremely important for paladins. It affects their defenses, it affects their smite, it affects all sorts of things. Resolve is not anywhere near the same for paladins. It's a nice defensive stat. It boosts their deflection, increases their concentration, so if they're on the front lines, it's important, but it's not vital and it's not associated with any of their class abilities directly. And the sort of question that I ask is, if something is required for viable play, why is it an option? Like, we want players to make meaningful choices and not put in gotchas and traps that say, like, well, yeah, you can kind of put these stats wherever you want, but not really. Like, like you can dump this. No, you can't. So if something's required for viability, that shouldn't be an option. So rather we would say, no, none of these are required for viable play, so it is really an option. So influencing statistics of importance to all classes. This took a long time, and as I'll say later, we had to actually revise this during beta and post-launch and into a couple of patches. So that process was fun. But this is, someone put this together on the Pillars of Eternity Gamepedia site, which is very nice. But it shows how things are affected. So you can see that each pair of stats contributes to one of the secondary defenses. 2 of the stats, or actually one of the stats contributes to 2 defenses, which is resolve. Those defenses are important to everyone. Even if you have a character, for example, that's not on the front lines, deflection is still attacked by arrows and guns and things like that. So you don't want to tank any of those. Endurance and health are important to everyone. Obviously for frontline characters, they're a little more important. But if you're playing a class like a wizard that already does not have much endurance or health, dumping that will be not good, and giving it a boost will be nice if you want to be a character that wades into the front lines. Damage and healing is important to everyone. Action speed is important to everyone. Interrupt and basically the ability to interrupt someone with an attack. Concentration, which is the ability to resist that. Accuracy, which is used for resolving every attack. You get the point. So the idea is that this is stuff that all classes use because they all have abilities that rely on them broadly. And that was to make sure that if you wanted to build a character of a certain type, you could play towards those strengths. So why do we not want to have bad builds? Well, role-playing is about building and expressing a character both through social interactions and through mechanics. And viability limitations, as I suggested before, can result in mid or late game roadblocks. You know, as the challenge sort of ramps up, you may find that how you built your character doesn't work. And you know, I've seen so many people playing a lot of role-playing games that said, like, I got 8 hours in, and I realized I did this all wrong, and now I have to start all over. Some people think that's fun. I don't think most people do. And if we have fewer viability limitations, then we have more viable character concepts. So you can make the Perceptive Genius Barbarian, which is actually a pretty darn good character in Pillars of Eternity because they affect a very large area with their carnage and they're very accurate. You can make the Idiot Muscle Wizard, which is a favorite of mine. So that's a character, a wizard that has a low intellect but has a very high might. So they don't have big areas of effect, they don't have long durations, but they do a huge amount of damage because might in Pillars of Eternity affects all damage, not just weapon damage, but spell damage, all sorts of damage. Or you can make the Clumsy Determined Rogue who has a low dexterity and a high resolve. They go into the front lines, they have good defense, good concentration. They don't attack that quickly, but they can still do a lot of damage, and they have good defenses for frontline attacks. We wanted to avoid the cool concept, bad character problem. So I have been a dungeon master for most of the time that I've been playing D&D, and I really hate the feeling when someone has a really cool idea for a character that is a sucky character, because they have a dream of playing this wacky dude or lady, And you know, I have to kind of say, like, there's nothing, like, the game doesn't support that. Like, you're not going to be able to make anything like that. That character's going to die, or you're going to be frustrated playing them because they're going to fail all their checks. It's not going to be good. So how does this happen? How it happens is that ability scores in classes can conflict. If you say, like, class A is good at X, Y, and Z, for example, like causing damage, rogues are good at causing damage, but ability B drastically impacts X and Z, then those are in conflict, because it means that if you set ability B to some low value, you're basically torpedoing the thing that your class is supposed to be good at. The mechanics and the content balanced around one another run into problems when these things are sort of, you know, converging. So in D&D terms, a warrior's 2-hit armor class 0 or base attack bonus goes up, and their strength is kind of supposed to be high and probably will get higher. And thus, armor classes for monsters increase, assuming that those things are going up together. If they're not, then that character is going to fall behind, and they're not going to be able to actually hit those characters as much as they should. So the example of the sort of the reasonably strong fighter I gave before, the other thing is that strength also affects your chance to hit. So that character not only is doing less damage per hit, but is hitting less frequently, so they're even farther behind, or further behind, sorry. Another example is rogues and reflex saves. They're already high. They have skills that are very good and based off of dexterity. They assume that your dexterity is high, so reflex saving throws and the difficulty classes of the skills that they use assume that those are both high. If you're not min-maxing them, then it's very difficult for the DM, or in our case, as people designing a computer role-playing game that doesn't adapt to the player's stats, it's very difficult to find a difficulty class that actually works. So you get this thing, the cool concept, the smart fighter that is bad in practice. The failure to min-max your key attributes means that your traits are lower, or your totals are lower overall, and the content that scales, assuming that the player is min-maxing, will just leave suboptimal characters behind. And that's where you get that mid-game non-viability or late-game mid-viability. Both are very frustrating. We wanted to ensure that dumping would sting. So dumping a stat is, again, like if you know, it starts at 10 and you're like, I don't need this, and you take it down to 3 and then you put the point somewhere else. So why did we want to ensure that dumping stings? It wasn't to be punitive. We weren't trying to say, like, we'll get you, player. But it was supposed to be a reality check. So again, if we said, hey, we put this stat or this, you know, thing on this attribute, for example, area of effect and duration. So we think area of effect and duration are important, and we think the value we give to it is important. But if we see players continually dumping them, then clearly it is not important to them. That might be a perception problem, which I should also say that a huge part of balance is actually just the player's perception. Whatever the sort of, there's no objective sort of understanding of it. It's all what they perceive of it. So if they're dumping it, you have to find a way to either communicate it better, or you have to look at the values of what it's affecting. If people don't care about dumping it, it's not that important. Go back. And choice and consequence is important to Obsidian games. We make role-playing games, and in our role-playing games, we think that if you make choices, there should be consequences for those, good consequences, and also bad consequences. So that is another part of it, is how you build your character. There are trade-offs to how you do that. Here are some good things about how this all turned out. I'll start with good things, and then I'll go to the things people didn't like. It is hard to make non-viable characters. Unless you're playing on the Path of the Damned difficulty, which is the highest level of difficulty, it's pretty hard to make a character that can't get through the game. And as long as you play toward the strengths of whatever the build of the character is, like, again, if you make a barbarian that has a high intellect, you want to emphasize your carnage, which is your big AoE melee attack, and other things that have an area of effect and duration-based effects, because that's what int affects. It's easy to build a lot of unusual and viable character concepts. I've seen lots of people that propose a lot of the weird characters that if you tried to make them in D&D would just be bad characters, but they're able to play them in Pillars of Eternity, and they're just fine, and they love playing them because they had that fantasy, and that's part of why we allow people to do these things. It is not hard to make different optimal builds that emphasize different things. Again, I'm not going to say that everything can be made into an optimal build, because then they wouldn't be optimal. Optimal is sort of the cream of the crop. So I've seen people make an interrupt-focused barbarian, so a barbarian that really focuses on just causing hit reactions on a lot of enemies at once. They ramp up their int, they ramp up their perception, and they just smack those guys all day long. A lot of people will make Gish muscle wizards. Gishes are sort of the fighter-wizard combos. They emphasize personal buffs and summoning spell weapons, super strong and powerful, versus a crowd control wizard. This is someone who focuses very heavily on big AoEs, stun-locking enemies, keeping them locked down, lots of debuffs. And min-maxers can still go wild. Like, you can't make Lawler skate in this. No one can make Lawler skate. By the way, did I mention that that guy lost a semester of his university making that character? I personally admire that a hell of a lot because I was a terrible student. But yeah, min-maxers can still go crazy on this stuff. Yeah, it does not get as wild as 3E or 3.5, but there's a lot of room for optimization in it. And despite the relative simplicity, the mechanics still allow for a lot of interesting analysis. So for example, accuracy and damage is a common trade-off. Each point of perception that a character has in Pillars of Eternity adds 1 on a 100-point scale to accuracy. And that shifts your miss, graze, hit, and crit ranges for all attacks. Now, 1 point is not very much, but it's shifting that all those attack windows. And so people do perceive that as being valuable. It's not, crazy powerful, but it does make a difference. Each point of might adds 3% to damage and healing from any source. So again, casting spells, shooting a gun, stabbing someone with a knife, whatever, those are all affected by your might score. If a character casts a healing spell, casts Lay on Hands, or Cure Stamina, then that is affected by your might score. So certain builds will rely more heavily on accuracy than damage output. So for example, the crowd control wizard that I mentioned, they're not really focusing on doing damage, but they really want to hit. They want their accuracy to be as high as possible. So with that, you can say like, well, my might doesn't really need to be that high because I'm not really focusing on doing damage. That's other characters doing that. I'm debuffing people, and I would just want to make sure that they're more likely to hit or crit. And so people do breakdowns and analyses of these, and a lot of it comes down to personal preference. What sort of character do you want to make, and how do you want to make that, or how do you want to play that character? So that's always good, is that we do want that room for interpretation in there. If it's really open and shut, well, this is superior all the time, then we kind of screwed up. So here are some common criticisms, things people either didn't like or continue to not like about Pillars of Eternity attributes. They aren't realistic. I'm not going to argue that they are. They don't have enough of an impact, certainly compared to D&D. I think that's a fair criticism. Perceived lack of value, when again this goes back to the difference between like what the numerical value is and what people really understand of that value. And the companions are awful. Oh my God, the worst stats you've ever seen. We'll see about that. So they aren't realistic. Well, AD&D is not super realistic either, which is kind of our starting point. AD&D kind of has some interesting things. There are AD&D and D&D, there are certain things that it seems like it is really trying to simulate. Like it is really trying to say like, no, this is like things work in the real world. Also, you can jump off of a cloud castle, fall and take 20d6 damage and get up and dust yourself off, and that's fine. So it's not super concerned necessarily with verisimilitude being really like reality. Pillars already abstracts a lot. There's a lot of stuff we already knew we were going to abstract. So for us, realism was not a priority. So, for players who, say that it is not realistic, and we go even, I would say we go even further in some cases. So for example, might affects gun damage, it affects spell damage, it affects, melee weapon damage. That's not realistic. That's done so that all that stuff is on one stat rather than being spread out in a way that certain classes can kind of ignore certain stats, or it doubles up for certain people, which is what happens in D&D. Like if you get things that align on one stat, then you're always supposed to max that, and it doesn't make any sense to, focus on the thing that affects the damage types that you don't use. So our focus was to try to make good gameplay out of these stats, and realism was not really a priority for us. Not enough impact. So because we wanted these characters to be ensured to be viable, that means that limited their relative impact. If you have something that goes up this high at the highest end and it drops down this low, there's a big chance, because that gulf is so huge, that something about the viability of the character is dropping into the netherworld. So whereas if you keep it in a more constrained range, it's much more likely to avoid viability problems. If you dump that stat, the character will suffer, but they're not an unplayable character. If you give a wizard in D&D a 3 constitution, they get 1 hit point per level and will die. Linear scaling means that we have a regular progression. So if you look at the strength table that I'm going to show you in a bit, you'll notice that there's a big dead zone, and then it ramps up pretty quickly at the ends. And so there is a much more significant sense of progression once you start really ramping up things like strength. You go like, wow, like the difference between these scores is really, really huge, but it kind of ignores the dead zone in the middle. So when you have a linear scaling, that does mean that it just kind of goes up at a very regular pace. Third edition skips the odd numbers, so they actually get it's a sort of skewed thing where every 2 points it goes up. So it's a different feeling than having a little teeny increment every single point. And we were trying to avoid what we already were known, and when I say known, I mean by the designers of D&D, imbalances in the scores. So if you look at some of the ways that things were designed in 3rd edition or 3.5, they understand that strength is an insane stat. It affects 2-hit, it affects damage, or rather it affects base attack bonus, or being added to attack bonus and damage. And so, for example, half-orcs get twice as many penalties as they get bonuses because they get a +2 to strength. Because they knew that if you give a half-orc a 20 strength and give them a great axe, they're going to chop through the entire world. So we knew, based on looking at how they designed those mechanics, by reverse engineering how they tried to solve those problems, that they knew that they were too powerful. So we said, like, well, we know that these things are crazy, so let's scale them back so that they're more balanced across the spectrum. So as an example, if you look at strength in D&D, if you have a two-handed sword with an 1800 strength, which is sort of like, good times, top human strength, you're doing 1d10 plus 6. 1 to 10 plus 6 is a lot better in terms of percentage than 14 to 20 plus 24%. So yes, much bigger impact in D&D. So if you want your stats to have a huge impact, we decided to err on the side of viability, not making characters really swing really wildly in terms of how their stats were built up. So this table shows AD&D strength damage adjustment. This is for comparison. You can see that big dead zone in the middle where it's just flat. That means there's no damage bonus. This is only looking at damage bonuses. There are other things that strength affects, but it's primarily damage. Assuming a two-handed sword, because it's 1 to 10, that means I can do percentage modification, and it's easy. If you use D8, then suddenly that's an even bigger percentage modification. But you can see how it kind of has some spots where it'll go 2 points and flatten out, and then it keeps going up, and then at 25 strength, they just go, get an extra. You get an extra +1 for fun. So there's not really a lot of rhyme or reason to it. I should also note that before 3rd edition, strength had this weird percentile system. So if you were a warrior and you had an 18 strength, you'd roll percentile, and that's how they incremented above 18 until you got to 19. That's why this chart is weird. D&D is weird. You got it. Now, if you look at Pillars of Eternity, strength damage adjustment, you can see that this is extremely linear. It's going up by 3%. Just so you can go back, you can see 140 is the top end at 25 strength. For us, 30 is the top end, and that's 60 strength. So it is quite a bit less of an impact, but again, that is by design. Some people don't like that, and that is okay, but we're not changing it. And then there's problems with perceived lack of value. And again, balance and perception of value is not just about what you set up, but about what the player actually perceives about it. And lots of stuff goes into perception of strength. I mean, I talked to someone, one of our system designers who had worked on a game where a gun was in a test, and everyone's like, God, this gun sucks. Like, it's just so horrible. Everything about it is just, it's junk. I never want to use it. And then they went through a tuning phase, and they changed the audio effects on the gun. And they did not change any of the stats. And they put it, they did another test. And the player's like, oh man, that gun's so good now. You guys got it. And it was purely audio. So lots of things go into perception of these things. So why did people have problems perceiving the impact of stuff or continue to have trouble perceiving them? One is that percentages are hard. If you ask people to do percentile modifiers, like, yeah, this is 23% better, like they're not immediately like, yeah, I got it. So, they kind of round off, but sometimes it gets difficult to do those versus, 1 to 10 plus 6. That is a little easier to conceive. Larger numerical values pose problems. So for various reasons, we used bigger numerical ranges. I think you noticed before our greatswords do 14 to 20 points of damage. So once you start saying like, hey, you have 2 or 3 digit numbers that you're supposed to do percentile operators on, players kind of start going like, I kind of get that, but I don't really get it. And we didn't have great feedback in the UI initially. Thankfully, Brian McIntosh and Kaz Aruga have improved this a great deal so that players can actually see comparisons like this is the base, this is the modified version. These are all the things that are contributing to this value. Transparency within the UI is extremely important. And that was a reason why, though, is that early on, people were just like, I mean, it says this damage value. I don't know what the base is. I don't know what's modifying it. I don't know how much my strength is actually contributing to this. And the companions are awful. So people complain about the stats of our companions a bunch. When we designed the companions, we did them this way for a few reasons. One is that the companions' attributes are reflecting who they are as characters. So go back to the Khalid example. Khalid's not a super tough guy. He's got a 15 strength. That's okay, man. Our attributes are designed to be middle of the road. So, if you make let's say you have a paladin, and that paladin is super min-maxed for damage. Our companion paladin, Palagina, is set up to be kind of like, well, you can use her for healing, you can use her for damage, you can use her for defensive stuff. Her stats are kind of more evenly balanced across what paladins can do. And despite the fact that players, plenty of players have played through on Path of the Damned, the hardest difficulty, using just the stock vanilla companions without modifying them, and they're just fine, a lot of players are still like, no, I want to change these stats. So I'll give an example of how people kind of change these stats. First example is Palagina. She is our paladin companion. Her character is described as being very willful. She's tough, but she describes failing her physical examinations in the Brotherhood more than once. So she's not especially strong. She is an avian godlike, meaning that she sort of has these bird-like features. She has heightened senses, and her eyes are frequently described in reaction text, like she's very perceptive of things. So the way that I statted this character, because this is the character that I made, it's kind of hard to see there, but she has a 12 might, 13 constitution, nothing too crazy, and then 14 perception, because she's avian godlike, and 13 intellect, and a 15 resolve, because she's very, very strong-willed. So this is from a mod called Better Companions. She has a 21 might. She's incredibly strong. She has a 15 con. Okay, that's fair. She has a 4 dexterity. Extremely, extremely clumsy. A 3 perception, which is about as bad as you could possibly get. She's a genius. She has a 20 intellect and an 18 resolve. So clearly this person wanted to do like one thing, or actually two things. They wanted to cast Lay on Hands, and they wanted to use their auras, because paladins have nice auras. If you want to hit something, good luck, because you have a 3 perception, so you're tanking your main attack stat. You can play a paladin this way, but this is like the way that you have to play this paladin. So our stance on this is we don't really care about people adjusting the companion stats. Maybe a little. It does seem weird to see that character who's described in that way be so different from how she's described. And, but the attribute system is designed to handle it. Again, like, it's robust enough that it doesn't, it's not that that character can't be played, you just have to play them a certain way. Sure, like, knock yourself out. Here's an example of how you could go crazy with another companion. Devil of Carrick is a rogue that you get in the White March. A lot of people like to complain about her stats and her armor. She has a relatively modest might score. It's 13. Might bonuses to damage are not multiplicative, but they add up. So every bonus to damage, they just kind of add up as a percentage modifier. So if you set her might to 18, you'd get an additional 15% damage. But a rogue sneak attack, which is their common, like they just get it all the time, they do it to anyone who's vulnerable to it, is plus 50% damage. So that alone is a huge bonus. Most rogue active abilities add 25% damage, and you get a bunch of those. So just netting 15% more damage is not really, I mean, it's making a difference, but it's not that big of a difference. If you dumped her might down to 3, that would be, actually it wouldn't be 30%, I think it's about 30% though, I think it's actually 27. But it's not that big of a deal, because you're already doing plus 50 from your sneak attack, and you're doing plus 25 on any active ability. So rogues are good at doing damage. Even if you tank their might, they're still pretty good at doing damage. And you probably put those stats somewhere else, so they're getting a bonus somewhere else. Significantly lower damage, but it's certainly not non-viable. So I'd like to talk a little bit now about the changes that we made during the development cycle and after launch. So we did have a pretty extensive beta, which is great. We got a lot of feedback on attributes. Initially, all attributes granted bonuses from 1. So if you looked at the scale before, like D&D kind of is balanced around 9 as being neutral, and then things above that give a bonus, things below it give a penalty. So we said, no, or actually I should say it's my responsibility. I said, yeah, at 1, that gives you a bonus, and it just keeps getting better. Well, people didn't really dig that. It was different from D&D, which in itself some people don't respond well to. The other thing is that we have this concept of perceived loss. Like, our perception of loss is way stronger than our perception of value. So with that sense of we want people to feel like dumping a stat is not really a great thing, as soon as we set those, like, we basically just normalized all the math and then said, oh yeah, a 10 is 0, and if you go down 1, you're at minus 3% damage. And immediately people are like, like, oh my God, I can't put anything to 9. And if you look at people's builds, a lot of people are they'll take everything down to 10, but that perception of badness from going negative is extremely strong and powerful. And I knew that at the beginning. I should have probably just had them at 10 to begin with, but, well, I didn't. We also had perception and resolve both contributed to deflection, so we had 2 things feeding into that stat. Perception initially granted +2 to accuracy per point. Everyone maxed this out as much as possible. It was really dumb. Like, everyone in QA made max perception characters, every little teeny bonus they could get to perception, because it's shifting your miss, graze, hit, and crit chances. It slides the whole thing up. So that was dumb. Constitution's bonus to endurance and health was only 3%. This is a minor thing that we adjusted later. Perception modified range. That felt terrible. Intellect modified radius, not area. Those are different things. And it did it in 3% increments. So throughout the course of the beta and into launch, and I don't remember when each of these things happened, like I said, I think we continued patching attributes through patch 2.0 maybe, or maybe even later than that. We averaged attributes around 10 with lesser values inflicting penalties. Perception now contributes to accuracy at 1 point per, and people seem to find that worthwhile. And resolve contributes to deflection just by itself. We increased the Constitution bonus to 5%, and that actually did make a significant difference in how people perceived it. 3% to 5% doesn't seem like it would be that big of a deal, but people perceive it as being a bigger deal, and so they actually kind of said, okay, I'm not going to dump this so much anymore. And intellect modifies area in 5% increments. So you can't make everybody happy. Obviously, not everyone was super thrilled with how this worked out. It's true of any design, but we did not set out to try to make everyone happy. We knew that we had an audience with a variety of tastes. Our implementation was within what we believed our audience's tolerance threshold were. So we know that some people that play our games, they would rather not have attributes at all. There are role-playing games like Mass Effect that has classes, but it doesn't have attributes at all. You don't have to do that. It's easier when you're not making a fantasy game. It's easier when you're not making a fantasy game based on D&D very clearly. So we know that some people, just sort of ideologically or because of their preferences for system design, they'd rather have no attributes at all. That's fine, we understand that. And we know that a lot of people wish that there were stronger or different attributes. And during our beta phase, there were people that got real upset about how we initially spec'd out attributes, how we changed attributes. There were some people that sort of forswore the game. They were like, I'm over this. So people have really strong feelings about this stuff. But we knew that there was a big group within our core audience that we could probably make something for them where most of those people would be happy. So usually, I still hear people criticize that, which is sort of like, we wish this were different, but it's not a deal breaker. And so that applies to class design, that applies to armor design, weapon, like all the stuff that we have in our game. There's a lot of stuff that people will say like, well, we wish this were not quite this way, but we're okay with it as it is. No data to support this. This is just anecdotes. We do have very active forums, lots of people that give feedback a lot. Also, there are lots of offsites, NeoGAF, RPG Codex, Something Awful, lots of very active communities there that have very robust discussions about this stuff. And ultimately, ideological purity doesn't necessarily mean the players are going to be happy. I think it's important to have ideology for what you're doing as a designer, but at a certain point, if what you're trying to accomplish sort of hits the players and the players go, I don't like this isn't fun, whatever your ideology is, you kind of have to step back and say, like, am I approaching this wrong? Is this a bad goal? Is this not really accomplishing what the players needed to accomplish? So start with an ideological point, but then move toward the players in a sense of like you want them to have fun with it. So yeah, that should always be a goal. Would we do it this way again? Probably. The benefits seem to outweigh the drawbacks. I will say that I spent an obscene amount of time talking with people about how to set up these attributes, how to tune these attributes, going back and forth with programmers on it, because the math gets really complicated. Seemingly it wouldn't, because we have a simpler system in many ways, but it does get very complicated. Listening to forum feedback and all that stuff. It really did take a lot of time and effort to make something that actually accomplished all the goals that we set out to do. And even there, like, we didn't necessarily do a perfect job on it, obviously. But the benefits of it do seem to outweigh the drawbacks. We were happy with the gameplay, so internally people seem to like, overall, how stats work. They like, adjusting and getting little stat boosting bonuses and using spells and buffs to raise those up. That's fun gameplay. And most of the players seem happy too. Like I said, there are some players that really don't like it. That is okay. Would I do this personally? No. I don't like that stuff. Like, I think attributes conflict with classes. They have a lot of problems. I don't even like class-based systems, so I've been playing Ars Magica for the past 2.5 years. That's a goofy game. So yeah, this isn't really about like my personal preferences though. Like as a designer, I'm looking at the audience, I'm looking at their expectations. Obviously, we kickstarted a game based on nostalgia, and that that's based in a lot of memories and feelings and emotions that people have. The point of designing this stuff is not to make something exactly as I want it, but to make something that I think will make a good game that sort of fulfills the expectations of the people that backed it and the people that want to come into this genre for the first time. I do want to thank a bunch of people that helped out with this stuff. I want to thank all of our backers. Obviously, we wouldn't have been able to make this game if it were not for them. Our beta testers, we had a subgroup of beta testers, and we still have beta testers that beta test our patches. They give a lot of great feedback. And players. We have a lot of players. We have great YouTubers. A lot of us at work, we watch these YouTubers and we see their breakdowns of their analyses of the classes. Sometimes it's very interesting to see how they perceive things. And we understand like, oh, crap, like they think it works like this. What are we doing wrong here? Yeah, but players give a lot of really fantastic feedback. Our QA testers, I think that especially in the non-development world, people don't really give QA enough credit. I think that, and in development also, I think there are a lot of places where QA is underappreciated. I spent a lot of time talking with our testers, and I still continue to spend a lot of time talking with our testers. They play the game all the time. They're trying to min-max and break everything. They have really good insight into how the game is played. I don't always agree with their analyses of things, but again, that's the point though, is like you want to listen to their viewpoint and hear where they're coming from on that stuff. But they were extremely valuable in how we built this stuff. And lastly, to Brenda Romero. So I had given up on trying to pitch talks that were this narrowly focused, because every time I did, they were like, this is really niche. Like no one cares about this stuff. So I had gone broader and broader and kind of stopped submitting things. And Brenda Romero actually contacted me and said, hey, I want you to do, or consider doing a really narrowly focused niche RPG talk. So thanks to her, I was able to do this. We have some time for questions, if anyone has anything. Oh, thanks. Hello.
Hey, thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.
In the old, like Baldur's Gate games, you usually had dump stats, and I remember specifically that you had, if you could have a low charisma, you can dump that down to 3, and like in the first tent outside Arenikos dungeon, you can get a ring that set charisma to 18.
Yeah.
So lots of people did that. It was like go-to strategy for many classes. How did you work with items to affect attributes and balance?
So the question was sort of compared to Baldur's Gate, where there were lots of items that influenced stats, and in fact would set stats to certain values, regardless of what their starting value was. How do we approach that in Pillars of Eternity? So in Pillars, we did something that's more like 3rd edition D&D, in the sense that we don't have items that that set stats to certain values. Instead, they give bonuses, and there are stacking rules for those. So you can min-max them a little bit, but at a certain point, it's only going to take the highest value from that. Part of that is also because if you think about, especially in the context of single-player CRPG, if a person has a strat guide, or if a person read a forum and they already know, oh, there's a Girdle of Hill Giant strength right here, well, then they can dump the points that they would have put in strength, they can put them in another stat, go straight to that Girdle of Hill Giant strength, and effectively they're playing with many more points in their attributes than other players are. So that kind of stinks. Like, obviously it's cool to have game knowledge and like knowledge of the world and be able to beeline for things and get that cool stuff, but that advantage, I think, should be a marginal advantage. It shouldn't be so gross. Like, because the difference, Girdle of Hill Giant strength is 19 strength. If you set your strength to 3, you just got 16 free attribute points. So yeah, we tried to keep those bonuses a little more constrained. I know that, again, some people would like those to be more significant. In the White March expansion, we added +4 items, which, oh my God. You know, people really like when those step up and they can, you know, keep ramping them up. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Hello. First of all, thanks for the game. It's great.
Thank you.
And I just had a question actually about the early process of design and the prototyping process. Since you were so steeped in tabletop design, what it was like to test such a complex system, if you went straight to digital or if you did paper prototyping or even a tabletop session, and how that sort of looked like and how you kind of got to where you are before the code happened.
We did not do any. So the question is how we prototyped prior to implementation.
Yep.
And since we had a lot of basis in tabletop, did we do any tabletop gaming? We did not. Part of that is because these stats would be a nightmare. It's funny too, because some people say like, hey, when's the tabletop version of this coming? I'm like, you want to do percentile operations on damage ranges that are like double digit? I don't think you actually do. So we didn't do that. We sort of charted things out in Excel to see like, what are the boundaries of this? How is this really mapping out with how we're planning out abilities and damage ranges and things like that? So it was mostly it was theoretical for a very long time. But we looked outside of D&D, we looked to other games and said, you know, how do we feel about balance in these games, and what are the sort of margins of influence? Like how impactful are these attributes on that, and how does that feel for the type of game that we're trying to make? And the nice thing was that you know, Tim Kaine did a lot of the implementation of the attribute things, and it was usually pretty easy if I went to him and I said, I was wrong, like these values are bad, we need to adjust this up or down or whatever. It was usually pretty quick turnaround, so we could test out those changes relatively rapidly. But yeah, I would have done tabletop sort of testing of that stuff, but the mechanics were really designed, and we wanted to design them for a CRPG. We wanted to say like, we got a computer here, we can do lots of calculations really easily for you. We don't have to base things on dice, you know, and so that's why our damage ranges are more things like, you know, 14 to 20. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So obviously the attributes are a pretty big exception, but was there anything else that came up kind of organically while you were designing the game that you wanted to put in, but you thought the nostalgia focus wouldn't allow?
Were there things that we wanted to put in that we thought the nostalgia focus wouldn't allow? Not really. There were certain things that we put in that people resisted very strongly because they weren't kind of part of their vision of what the experience was. So for example, we have firearms in Pillars of Eternity, but they're all like 16th century era firearms. And while Forgotten Realms did have guns as early as 2nd edition, they weren't part of the Infinity Engine games at all. And so a lot of people thought that was just like, they were like, no, that doesn't work. That feels completely wrong. And there were certain things that early on we decided we should probably have these because we think a lot of people will miss them if they're not there. So for example, we have humans, we have elves, we have dwarves. I think a lot of people like humans, elves, and dwarves. We don't have halflings, we don't have half-orcs. So we're like, we don't need to have those. We can put in a Maua, they're our big race. And then we have Orlans as our small race. So we kind of figured that people like that idea of like the sort of big race and small race. We didn't think people were that attached to the idea of like, I must play my halfling or gnome in this game. So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the different difficulty options in your game and kind of how that influenced your attribute design. I find that, you know, the higher difficulty goes, usually that leans more towards min-maxing, less towards viable characters. And since some of your most dedicated players are going to be like interacting with those systems, I feel like it urged to always look there and not look at like viable characters. So I was wondering what your experience with that was.
So the question is about our difficulty design and how that influenced our attribute design. And so we have, easy, normal, hard, and then we have a few other crazy ones, the most significant of which is Path of the Damned. And we, except for Path of the Damned, we did not do stat modifications on creatures. Instead, we changed the composition of encounters. So if you're on normal, you might see, like a wizard and 2 paladins. But on hard, it's like an archmage. It's a completely different, like more powerful wizard and 2 paladins and like a rogue gets added into the group. And it's in a weird position where it makes it more tactically difficult for you to deal with it. But Path of the Damned was specifically designed for the most aggressive players. And so we said, like, this mode, not only does it have all the creatures from all levels of difficulty, but they all have increased stats. So they have better defenses and better accuracy. And we kind of said with Path of the Damned, like, we know that there is a gulf between viable and optimal, and this is where the players who want to push that envelope, like, they need to do that. If you just kind of stumble in like, hey, Path of the Damned, what's this? And like you just kind of try to stumble and bumble through, you're probably going to die. So yeah, we wanted to make sure that viability for characters didn't require crazy optimization even on hard. But on Path of the Damned, there are some really good Path of the Damned players who don't even feel like you need to optimize that much on Path of the Damned, but they're really good players. Most people have to get a little more ambitious with how they're looking at their stat spreads and things like that. Their gearing becomes much more important on Path of the Damned. So that's how it tied together.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so talking about dump stats, I get the feeling that a lot of RPG players kind of naturally assume that, if you're playing a fighter, you want to dump charisma. If you're playing, a wizard, you want to dump like dexterity or something like that. How did you guys communicate to new players of your game that you don't necessarily want to, just dump all your perception?
Yeah, so that is a tricky thing, and we did have to deal with that a lot. Thanks for bringing that up. We did have a thing where, people would look at somebody and they're like, wizard, strength? I don't think so. And then they're like casting their, damage spells and they're like, what the heck is going on? Because, in D&D, usually stats don't affect your spell damage at all. So they had no expectation of that. So one is, again, like trying to make the UI reflect, clearly say, like, this affects damage, like all damage. But the other thing we did is one of our programmers, Robbie, put in a thing where we could add little stars next to character attributes in certain classes to say, like, this is kind of important. Like, to sort of say, like, you might think this is not important. Look again. So I think wizards had like either a silver or a gold star next to might to sort of say, like, this is more significant than you might think it is. You can still dump might, but if you dump might, you're going to make a crowd control character or something like that. You're not going to be focusing on damage. But yeah, it is a difficult problem because, again, we're dealing with a lot of expectations. We called it might, hopefully to make a player go like, wait a minute, isn't that normally strength? Is this something different? It is something different, friend. It's something that affects damage and healing for everything. So sometimes it's the nomenclature. Like charisma, we got rid of and replaced it with resolve. It's sort of similar, but it affects like deflection, it affects concentration. Very different from how charisma works mechanically in D&D. Although resolve is also used in conversations for, being like a real intense kind of a person. So it's difficult, but we tried to use naming and UI sort of signaling to help guide people in that direction.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any last questions? All right, thank you everyone for coming.